Well, welcome everyone to this virtual Rothermere American Institute event. The Rothermere American Institute is the University of Oxford's Centre for the Study of the United States and its place in the wider world. And I'm Daniel Rowe, the Director of Academic Programs here at the RAI. Most pertinently for today's session, I'm a historian who works on the urban history of the late 20th century. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this second event in the Alan Locke virtual seminar series, a seminar series named in honor of the first African-American Rhodes Scholar and renowned interpreter of African-American art, literature, and philosophy. At the RAI, we're proud to host a seminar and to name the materials in the Vere Harmsworth Library in the collection on African-American history, culture, politics, and biography after Locke. And I especially want to take this moment now to thank the Association of American Scholars for the support that they provide to enable this collection to be growing every year. And this year's collection has just arrived, and I can testify that it's taking up even more space in a sort of marquee place in the library, and it's a delight to see that. Today's roundtable session will highlight both cutting-edge research on African-American history and politics taking place within the RAI walls, and books that I'm delighted to say will soon become part of the Locke collection that I'll be able to walk past and pick up, and so will our students. And this is an event that I've particularly been looking forward to because the chance it offers to bring two people together in the same virtual seminar room who haven't been together or interacted with each other in an academic sense before today. Will allied the pre-meeting a week or so, a few days ago. So this session will bring two panelists. We'll begin with two panelists summarizing their book projects that they are or have been working on. And after that, we'll open up into a roundtable discussion format where I'll pose some questions to the panelists. They might interact with each other, discuss their book projects, but I'll also pose to them questions asked by the audience. So please do put into the chat any questions that you have, and we'll get through as many as we possibly can in the hour that we have together. So it's my pleasure then to introduce our two speakers today, Professor Kimberly Johnson and Dr. Sarena Martinez. Kimberly Johnson is a professor of social and cultural analysis at New York University. And most importantly, for our purposes, she's the John G. Winant Professor of American Government visiting this year at the RAI. Kim is the author of many articles on African-American politics, especially in the field of American political development. And she's the author of two landmark books in this field, Reforming Jim Crow and Governing the American State. Kim has a third book in press with Cornell University, and that book is entitled Dark Concrete, Black Power Urbanism and the American Metropolis. That book will be released in December 2025, so a perfect gift opportunity for the holiday season. And that's that book project that she'll speak to us today about, as well as her broader thoughts about American political development and Black urban politics more generally. Our second speaker is Sarena Martinez. Sarena is a student at Yale Law School, and Sarena completed an excellent US history doctorate in Oxford in October 2024. And I say that as someone who was on the examining committee for that doctorate. So I'm prepared to both defend my name, but also make a case that it was an excellent doctoral project. She's now in the process of turning that project into a book alongside her law studies. I'm sure that's a straightforward and easy task to balance those competing demands. And that book project is tentatively entitled Urban Power, Black Mayors, Managing Inequality in Kurt Schmoke's Baltimore. Prior to coming to Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, Sarena worked as a manager of special projects in the Department of Innovation and Economic Opportunity at the City of Birmingham, Alabama. So in short then, these are two extremely well-equipped people to speak to us on our topic tonight and to share their thoughts. I look forward to the conversation and to, in the coming months and years, seeing their books in our downstairs Locke collection. Over to you, Kim.
Great. Thank you so much, Dan, for that wonderful introduction. And I'm really excited to be here tonight to have this hopefully really generative discussion about Black urban politics. It's something that I've been thinking about and working on for a while now. And so I think what I'm going to do mostly is just talk about a little bit about the book that's, as Dan said, it's forthcoming in December 2025. And then maybe talk a little bit about kind of what I think is sort of happening next in terms of Black urban politics. So I'm going to start with a curious moment in Black urban history. People move, humans move, power to the people, whether they're Black, white, blue, whatever, was Bobby Seale's philosophical comment about the 2013 sale of his parents' North Oakland house to real estate investors. The house, which was bought in 1960 for about $13,000, was sold for $200,000 in 2013. It was renovated and then put onto the market for about $400,000 a year later. The property was described as a, quote, light field house with maple, stainless steel, and quartz features, a trendy showpiece worthy of better homes and garden. In a strange irony, the house's dining room was where Bobby Seale and Huey Newton would create the Oakland branch of the Black Panther Party. They would also craft the party's 10-point plan, which offered a blueprint for radical new construction of urban life based on the broad pillars of land, bread, housing, education, clothing, and peace. Bobby Seale is pretty philosophical about this, a little concerned about the sale, stating that he was dismayed by the 100% markup, as it, quote, was the same crap that got us into the financial mess started in the first place. The financial mess that he was talking about was the 2008 subprime mortgage collapse, which decimated brown and Black mortgage holders in neighborhoods across the United States. And then in the decade before the collapse, financial institutions like Wells Fargo Bank targeted Black and brown neighborhoods, and particularly Black elderly women across the US with subprime mortgages and other kinds of predatory loans. Indeed, one study found that between 2007 and 2011, 1 in 7 Oakland mortgages entered default, with 1 in 14 eventually lost to foreclosures. The study also found that these foreclosures were almost all located in the city's brown and Black neighborhoods, especially in West and East Oakland, the home of the Black Panther Party. More disturbingly, researchers would find later that the location of these foreclosed homes mapped almost perfectly onto Oakland's HOLC redlining map that many of us are familiar with. 3 years after the sale of Bobby Seale's parents' house in 2013, so in 2016, another local think tank found that only 4 Black borrowers in Oakland received mortgages from America's top 12 banks. So imagine that, a community of thousands of African Americans and only 4 people, 4 households received mortgages. And so I think the scale, what I call, and others would call this, so scale of this racialized risk and exclusion carried over onto the streets. For a long time, neighborhood residents' daily life in Oakland, or what remained of Black Oakland, was fraught with uncertainty and dread. One neighbor reflected that, quote, when I moved here in 1994, the whole block was Black. Now there are probably 3 Black owners. Some people call it gentrification. Indeed, the few remaining Black residents of the neighborhood, Seale's neighborhood, described feeling increasingly under surveillance, reporting that, quote, the new people have a very negative perception of the neighborhood's young Black males. This sense of disquiet and alienation was rooted in reality. Oakland's Black population had dropped by over half, from 47% in 1980 to 22% in 2020. And as Oakland went, so too did the rest of the Bay Area's Black population. San Francisco's Black population, 13% at its highest, was at a low of 5.7%. East Palo Alto, another community that I look at in my book, was 60% Black in 1970 and was now around 10% Black. in the 2020s. So my book then, which is called Dark Concrete, The Rise of Black Power Urbanism and the American Metropolis, is about what I call a newly formulated claim to remake the American city and reorder the basis of urban politics and metropolitan spaces. It was a demand that the city both could and should be a site for new urban order that envisioned African Americans to be the major actors in shaping the late 20th century city, rather than junior partners or victims in the post-war urban renewal order. Black Power Urbanism claimed the right of African Americans to shape urban spaces as just cities, places to survive and thrive, rather than accepting that Black people and Black life were simply objects to be controlled and contained in urban spaces. In these new just cities, Black Power Urbanism re-envisioned and attempted to put into place ideas about the centrality of space and race, both real and imagined, and the ways in which Black life could or ought to be lived in the city. These visions, which George Lipsitz calls the Black spatial imaginary, were based on a view of communal life that privileged use value over exchange value, sociality over selfishness, and inclusion over exclusion in the face of ongoing forces of displacement, dispossession, and exclusion. I argue in my book that Black Power urbanist cities expanded this imaginary by insisting that homes were places to live and thrive, not investment vehicles, where schools nurtured children rather than expelled them, and cities were places where living, drinking, and socializing while Black were not automatically considered the basis for heavy-handed, if not brutal, policing. Black Power urbanist cities were imagined places where living a good life rested on communal support and solidarity rather than self-interest, and a vision of urban life where everyone is brought together rather than sorted into winners and losers. In my book, I sketch out Black Power urbanism's path across 4 different Black metropolitan spaces: Oakland, California, as well as East Palo Alto, California, right across the highway from Palo Alto and at the center of Silicon Valley. And then 2 other spaces, Newark, New Jersey, and East Orange, New Jersey, to give 2 different metropolitan spaces in 2 different regions. I then look within these 4 spaces, I look at 3 policy areas central to urban policymaking: housing, education, and policing. And through these multiple strands, I explore the different formations under which Black Power urbanism emerged and developed, and the factors that shaped the origins, fragility, and death in the case of Oakland and East Palo Alto, as well as its durability and evolution in the case of Newark and East Orange. By focusing on these specific policy arenas, again, housing, education, and policing, it allows for more intensive analysis and unearthing of what people imagined and tried to put into place, both within and outside of the sphere of government. This, in turn, I would argue, can help us explain how and why Black Power urbanism was initially taken up in these cities, and subsequently the divergent paths that ensued. By focusing on space, important historical scholarship on race and urban political development can be more clearly linked to broader questions of state development. All of this then is resting on what I call Black urban political development. Black urban political development is defined as the longstanding processes of political and social mobilization of African Americans within urban areas in the United States. It encompasses the historical and contemporary efforts of Black communities to secure power, advocate for their rights, and address systemic issues affecting their communities. The political and social mobilization occurred within racialized spaces within these cities and suburbs in which Black residents created a sense of community from the physical manifestations of schools, churches, small businesses, saloons, and the corner to the effective and at times solidaristic ties created by the sharing of these racialized spaces. So it's a kind of ambitious book because I'm really trying to figure out what's happening in these cities from essentially 1960 to 1970 across these 3 policy areas. And what I find is a politics of what I call Black Power urbanism that is both shaped by the political agency of Black residents in these cities, but then also shaped very much by the overarching political institutional structures in which these Black power activists, as well as neighborhood activists, are embedded within. And so I don't want to over take too much time, but what I do find is quite fascinating that Oakland and East Palo Alto were far more radical cities in the sense of having a much brighter, far more visible presence of Black Panther activism. But in many ways, the activism did not, in fact, lead to a sort of durable residue of Black power urbanism. That is, the ability of African Americans to fully reshape urban politics around education and around education and housing and policing really was in the end quite limited, despite, again, this sort of, I think, the dramatic presence of Black Panther activists. By contrast, what I find in Newark and East Orange is that machine politics, the structure, the institutional structure of machine politics, enabled Black power urbanist activists to really take hold of urban policy making structures and really fundamentally reshape education and housing and policing in ways that simply were not available or possible to their compatriots on the West Coast. And so in many ways, what I'm arguing is that Black power, when Black power meets urban politics, you end up, not all cities end up in the same place. That is to say, in some cities, Black power is a short-lived phenomena that leaves possibilities in its wake that are hard to achieve, versus other cities where Black power is able to actually change how politics is thought of, and that the impact of Black power urbanism ends up being far more durable and long-lasting in ways that we are still, I think, grappling with. And I'll kind of leave it at that. That's about my 10 minutes. And I'll turn it over, I guess, to Sarena.
Yeah, hey everyone. My name is Sarena, and super excited for your book, Kim, and yours too, Dan, which you should also talk about. So I just wanted to start out first by kind of talking about my background and kind of what brought me to this project and what questions animated it, and then sort of give an overview of the project, and then maybe some questions that are more alive for me right now that kind of reflect on the contemporary. So prior to starting my DPhil, as Dan mentioned, I was an economic development practitioner for the City of Birmingham. And so I worked for a team that was really trying to modernize the economic development philosophy for the city, and trying to move from okay, the city's focused on, recruiting, retaining, expanding large industrial manufacturing companies, to one that thinks about not just how do we create jobs, but how do we create quality jobs? How do we prepare people for those jobs? How do we make sure that people can actually access those jobs? And kind of what is the role of the city in an inclusive economy? What should it be? And through that job, I bore witness to a lot of different dynamics. There was a constant tug of war between the city and the state over what powers the 700-page Alabama Constitution gave to the city to do things like take a statue down, to we were working on starting a tuition-free college program, on passing emergency small business loan funding during COVID. And what we often had to do, what we did was we would ask our private partners to help us, or institutional partners to help us supersede our municipal borders, and form workarounds around any sort of obstacles that the state posed. This was remarkably effective in the short term, but of course raises all kinds of concerns about the types of consequences that this has on democracy in the long term. And so that's kind of what brought me to grad school. I wanted to think about how does federalism work? How does power work? How does the local shape the national, and vice versa? Why do cities always get blamed for different economic challenges that they have or undergo? And then probably most important, and maybe most unanswered, I guess, is, what does the role of cities need to be if we want a more inclusive future in our democracy? And so I wanted to do a historical project and think about the late 20th century. And the late 20th century was an era of Black mayors. In 1967, two cities elected their first Black mayors. By 1993, 67 cities with more than 50,000 residents had elected Black mayors. And so my project focuses on kind of the latter part of this. I focus on Baltimore during the tenure of the city's first elected Black mayor, Kurt Schmoke. He was mayor in the 1990s there. And the majority of scholarship that I sort of came across, to the extent there's some biographical treatments of Black mayors, a lot focuses on whether or not they were successful. So trying to figure out ways to think about, did they actually carry out their equity agendas or not? And in many cases and spaces, it's sort of reduced to this idea of a hollow prize. So these mayors inherited a city that was in inexorable structural decline with very little power to advance equity. And to the extent that city power is discussed at all, the focus is kind of on, to what extent did the city have fiscal sovereignty or policymaking autonomy? And if it doesn't, then that's it. The city's powerless. I'm of course not here to, take issue with the fact that like there was urban decline in the late 20th century, but residents and city officials, kind of as Kim just talked about, like they didn't surrender. They contested it. They innovated. They organized. Sometimes challenged inequality. At other times, unwittingly enabled it. And so, what I wanted to do with this project was to focus on these actors who were fighting for equity and to think about, chronicling their power struggles and then trying to mine that to understand what are they doing? How are they sourcing power in a time when cities are so limited resource-wise? And what I find, and this sort of builds on the work of some other scholars, is, it's not from independence, but it's from interdependence. So, Mayor Schmoke sourced power from being at the center of many influential agents of governance in the city. My project starts out by conceptualizing governance in a city as being latticed. This isn't new. This is something that's but it's very implicit in historical literature. And so I wanted to bring that to the fore and think about, okay, the mayor is sort of one node in this lattice, but there's also universities, corporate actors, churches, civic leaders, the state and the federal government that are all exerting some kind of power over the city. And so what ends up happening in these power struggles where people are fighting for more equity in things like critical goods like education or health or housing or auto insurance. And importantly, also, thinking about actors that have not just local, state, national, or global, or that have all of these kinds of agendas. So think about like universities. Johns Hopkins in Baltimore has a local agenda. It also has a state agenda, a national agenda, and maybe even a global one. And so I wanted to try to understand, like, how does that help? Or how are people who are fighting for equity sort of using that to think about building more power? And so each chapter of the project looks at a different power struggle over these critical goods. I define the actors who fought for more uniform distribution of education, of housing, of health, of auto insurance as equity champions. And then I think about the actors that they were challenging as adversaries, those who are fighting to maintain control over the unequal administration or distribution of these goods. And the thesis of the project is that in the 1990s, these adversaries are deliberately and systematically suppressing the power of cities, suppressing the power of these equity champions in an effort to manage and justify inequality. So it's not that Schmoke inherited a hollow prize, but that the prize was further hollowed. So I'll give you an example of that and then sort of tell you why I think that's important. So for education, so that my education chapter focuses on the struggle between the city of Baltimore and the suburban controlled state legislature over the provision of education. Mayor Schmoke enters office on this campaign promise that he's going to make Baltimore the city that reads. improve literacy, it's going to improve education. This story will be familiar to many folks on this call. Baltimore schools are severely underfunded due to Maryland's reliance on local property taxes, disproportionately benefiting wealthier suburban districts. And so for years, you get different forms of equity champions. When Schmoke comes in, it's him, community groups, the city school system, lobbying for changes to the state education financing system to no material avail. And so to bring state officials to the negotiation table, Mayor Schmoke threatens to file a lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of the state's education finance system. These are going on during this time all across the country. I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that if that's interesting to anybody. Of course, when the threat fails to yield more equitable outcomes, Schmoke follows through on the threat and actually sues the state officials. This is an exercise of power. The lawsuit threatens judicial scrutiny of Maryland's constitutional responsibility to deliver an adequate education. It's a demand that suburbs cede control of resources by re-engineering a system which they're disproportionately benefiting from. It outrages the state, who files a counterclaim demanding that Baltimore City public school system actually restructure their management system. And sort of, their claim is that the issue with schools is not financing first, it's actually bad management, something that I'll sort of return to later. And then to pressure Schmoke, the state legislator even decides to withhold funding to the schools at one point. And so it's this very protracted battle. But what ends up happening is that the state legislator expands state control over the school system. So eventually in 96, they sign a consent decree. The city of Baltimore is able to secure additional resources for the school system, but the cost is a loss of control over the management of the Baltimore City public school system. So now the state co-appoints the board, the superintendent is turned into a CEO, and there's all these other changes, that sort of follow. And that's a structure that persists until 2016. And we can go back and forth and debate about, the merits of the consent decree or the specific education policies that, could or couldn't have worked. But what I find most fascinating as it sort of relates to this project is the fact that this whole battle resulted in increased state control over the city, a reduction of urban autonomy. And so, to think about kind of why all of this matters, what we think when we think about, our world today, our sense of what a city can do, is our sense of what a city should do is influenced by our understanding of what a city can do, which is influenced by what our understanding of what a city has done, which is why I think urban history is so important. And I guess just sort of as a last bit, I think if we look today, this sort of mechanism of reducing or sort of eroding city power continues. So since 2010, Republican state supermajorities have, sharpened a kind of new tool to do this called Richard Berfault, who's a legal scholar, calls this the new preemption. And so this is a case where states are, very sort of systematically overriding or outlawing things like sanctuary cities, voiding municipal minimum wage laws in the case of Birmingham, preventing local plastic bag bans, penalizing elected officials for adopting local gun control measures in states like Arizona and Florida, and in many cases requiring local governments to maintain Confederate monuments. Of course, there's also instances, in addition to state preemption, of states enacting full-scale takeovers, promising to sort of swoop in and provide oversight or accountability to the local. This happened in Detroit. This happened in Flint. Scholars have found that takeovers are significantly more common in majority Black cities. I know, Dan, you probably have some thoughts on this. But here's what's really interesting. They often rely on narratives of local incompetence that I would argue build on longstanding efforts to discredit minority mayors forged in the late 20th century, and so we have to think about these things as part of the reason and sort of the role of the media in all of this, from ascribing blame to certain crises to local officials, to doing things like describing the involvement of other nodes in this lattice of governance, like the state or the federal government, as natural and apolitical. So I'll stop there. Looking forward to hearing what folks think.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sarena and Kim, for talking about your fascinating and really interesting book projects. I mean, I have some questions arising from what you've said, but I'll sort of we'll try and get some questions from the audience as well. But question from what you said, Sarena and Kim. I was thinking about this more, but it's a question about the arc or trajectory of the stories that you're telling. I was thinking this particularly in the last moment, Sarena, of your story. Are these rise and fall stories, or are they decline and fall stories? What is the trajectory? And I was thinking this particularly for you, Sarena, whereas you were just talking now. If the prize isn't hollow, is it hollowing? Right? What is the direction of travel in the stories across the timelines that your projects are, and how do we explain the direction of travel? Is it unidirectional? Is it up and down? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that of what the arc of the stories is.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way I think about change is more like counter-cyclically. It's, yes, I think it is hollowing. I sort of see like the arc of the 90s in Baltimore as some set of efforts across a group of people who, as I said, are fighting for more equitable provision of goods, um, being pretty formidable and resulting in a sort of backlash and in an erosion of urban power, a hollowing of the prize, maybe we can say. But then the next iteration of that is likely and probably, and I haven't looked too much into the 2000s, but I think we can all come up with some examples, is that people fighting back again. And then maybe like there is additional hollowing, and so I sort of think about it as that kind of counter-cyclical dynamic. And I think it's very easy to miss, and which is part of the reason why I'm so excited by projects that try to attend to these narratives of local control.
I think that I sort of have struggled with the idea of a hollow prize. Um, I mean, the phrase itself is actually um, formulated kind of right at the beginning that Black mayors sort of assume power. And so it's already saying, well, these are going to be failures. And, I think if the metric, if one metric of failure is disinvestment, the rise of, the quote unquote urban underclass, then sure, yes, cities did experience this. Many cities did experience this. But if we think about other kinds of metrics, right, that with the advent of uh, majority Black administrations, did that actually change policing? It did. Now there's a really great body of literature, political science literature, that found that in fact Black mayors actually changed at least the composition of police forces, right? And so you went from police forces that were predominantly of one race and often had quite terrible relationships with communities of color to more integrated police forces that probably still had some of the same issues, but at least the sort of tension between police and communities of color kind of lessened in this moment of integration. I'd say the same thing with education. I mean, I think that when Black administrations appear, one of the first things that they do is they actually start a whole wave of fiscal equity cases. So these are starting in the late 1960s and early 1970s. People like Marcus Foster in Oakland, in Newark as well. These are all cases that are coming out of these cities that sort of provide the first wave of state education equalization formulas, and then housing as well. And so I think that, hollow, yes, in terms of yes, we do see dramatic and quite uh, damaging disinvestment. But if we think about what's happening in terms of specific policy areas, I think that you do see that Black administrations, at least during this moment, make a difference. It is, I think, by the late 1990s and 2000s, the ability of Black administrations and Black mayors to sort of do things is very much constrained because of the rise of neoliberalism and basically the sort of taking away of governmental power from these local jurisdictions.
Yeah, Kim, I was just reminded of Elizabeth Todd Breland, who always says, like, it's not disinvestment, it's investment, just in different things, investment in the carceral state, investment in, certain forms of workfare and maybe some other things associated with neoliberalism. So, yeah, I agree.
Now, I wonder about the relationship between sort of mass and elite politics within the stories that are in your book. Obviously, on the face of it, Sarena, your story is about elite politics, although it's bringing in others. And then on the face of it, Kim, your story is about mass politics. But what is the interaction between the two and the sort of insurgency dynamics and everything else that is at play within your stories?
I mean, I think what I would say is that this is where I make the case that Black urban political development actually is important, that how African Americans get to cities, the kinds of communities that they create actually shape the kinds of elite mass interactions that are within these communities. And as these communities intersect with broader political structures, that too has an effect. So in Oakland, for example, you had a very small but very strong Black middle class who had sort of clientelistic relationships with white city leadership. And what's the irony of it is that after the Black Panther Party moment has sort of come and gone, the people who end up kind of running the first Black mayor of Oakland is actually from that sort of original sort of small Black middle class elite. And that really, I think, is a testament to the durability of these sort of overarching political structures, which is that Oakland was a reform city versus Newark, which was very much ethnic politics machines. And so in Newark, what you have is you have the ability that it's really not a politics of elites of the NAACP or sort of Black civic groups, but it really is sort of people who are embedded into or have created their alternative kind of urban ethnic machines. And those people are able to kind of insert themselves into urban politics and kind of stay there. And so in many ways, Newark still has a Black mayor, even though it's still slightly majority Black, versus Oakland, which has had Black mayors, but they are not necessarily Black mayors in the sense of centering Black activism and Black sort of interests at the core of their administrations.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say one thing I'm kind of thinking through or find interesting is like the different forms of contestation that are available to like by elite politics or mass politics. So one of my chapters I mentioned focuses on auto insurance and this is an effort if you're a Baltimorean in the 1990s and you are paying for auto insurance, which is mandatory by this point at the state level, you're paying 2 to 4 times what your suburban counterparts are paying per month. Incredibly cost prohibitive for people. You need a car to get to a job. There's many sort of equity implications of this. And actually, sort of offshoot of Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Coalition, someone who was involved with that in Baltimore, they start to sort of really get interested in organizing around some sort of issue that will, unite the Black, white, poor, middle class, and they settle on auto insurance. So it's this 58-year-old ardent socialist, a Robert Kaufman, who starts with a bunch of other folks, the Citywide Insurance Coalition, Quick. They start with like a bake sale where they, take $200 and turn it into 2,000, and that's like enough to start off. And the whole point of this, quick effort is to basically mobilize grassroots politics to challenge what is insurer control over definitions of risk. So they want to create, they don't just want to reduce auto insurance costs. They want to create a municipal insurer that will be public, that will be a steward of risk and invest in risk reduction, and that will be more affordable to Baltimoreans. And so they get 200 nonprofit organizations to sign on. There's all these sort of very public shows where they kind of march into City Hall and like demand that the mayor assist them and whatever. They kind of catch notice of the state insurance commissioner who starts hearings with existing insurers who have control over the market, the private insurers who serve the Baltimore market. And that's like the first time that has happened in 17 years. So they have some successes. But to get to your question, what's interesting is, for this group in particular, what they would love for the city of Birmingham to do in the state is to give them funding to start their own municipal insurer. They are very skeptical of city and state involvement in this, of elite politics involvement in it, because they just think it will lead to regulatory capture and they're not interested in doing that. The city of Birmingham, or I'm sorry, the city of Baltimore, what it wants is for there, did I cut out? Okay. The city of Baltimore, what it wants is for the state to regulate insurers more. And so it says, quick, we're listening to you. Yeah, maybe let's see how the state insurance hearings play out. But what we're going to advocate for is increased regulation of auto insurers. And then the state's a little unclear what they want, but they sort of come out in different ways. And so it's this kind of moment where, you have the kind of polyphonic public like wrestling with the city and with the state, and there's competing visions of maybe how risk should be assessed, and sort of what types of insurance should be provisioned and available for Baltimoreans. And what ends up happening is that the insurers basically make the movement kind of loses, like peters out. It loses some steam. The state gives a little, the insurers give a little, and then a new administration comes in, funding runs out for the organization, and that's kind of it. That's like one version of the story. Another way to think about it is, the advocacy of this like mass politics, forced scrutiny of practices of private actors who controlled provision of a critical good that may not have otherwise happened. Maybe, the city of Baltimore to some extent stopped some of that. Maybe it enabled some of that. But what's sort of interesting about this is like thinking about the interplay between these different forms of advocacy and like that being the most important thing, and democracy being able to preserve contestation for its equitable functions.
Thank you. I mean, I'm wondering, you sort of, I think both touched on it a bit, but I'm wondering if you could speak a bit more about the sort of the contemporary valences and sort of how the research that you've done and are doing and the writing that you have done and are doing informs or shapes how you understand this in the contemporary urban Black political landscape, in Baltimore, beyond Baltimore, in Oakland, beyond Oakland, in Palo Alto, etc. But sort of what it is that you've taken from from these projects, as I've said, the contemporary valences, analogs, and everything else.
I mean, I think that what really struck me is how powerful what I call this sort of Black power spatial imaginary has proven to be. And so I think about groups like Moms for Housing in Oakland, a group of mothers primarily Black mothers, who take control of a house that had been sort of warehoused by real estate investors, with the claim that, people need houses and we're going to live in this house. And they really explicitly kind of call upon and the sort of Black Panther uh, 10-point plan. I mean, they talk about we need housing. Housing is a right. And you see this happening in East Palo Alto, where they draw upon this idea of the Black Power movement in East Palo Alto to push back against this sort of massive gentrification and displacement that's taking place in that city. And I think it's really fascinating to see it in a place like Newark, where the current mayor, Ross Baraka, is the son of Amiri Baraka, who's one of the sort of leading Black nationalists of the 1960s. And he repeatedly invokes Black Power urbanism as kind of the motivating force for how do we rethink policing in Newark. So Newark has actually had dramatically lower levels of dramatically lower murder rate, for example. Its police brutality rates has gone down. And one of the things that they've actually done is they've taken the police precinct, which was the epicenter of the Newark riots or rebellion of 1967, and they've actually turned it into, or the plan is to turn into a museum of policing, with the idea that police brutality is actually a public health issue. And so I think there are ways in which you see the afterlives, this really incredible afterlife of Black Power urbanism being deployed to help people make the claim that no, we can live in cities in a far more better and more just way.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add to that. I think one thing that I sort of think about is like if we think about these different actors that have control over a city, different types of private actors or institutions or um, universities or the state, like if we think about how each of them sort of thinks about what a city is pretty differently. So for insurers, like they draw territories. And so if we were to kind of, erase the municipal political borders of Baltimore, then and sort of think about it, define it in their spatial terms, we would see a map of basically three territories in Baltimore. That's like what it would be, and there are things inside of that and there are things outside of that. And it's like education districts, like those borders are different. The when we think about something like provision of sewage or like water infrastructure, the control that financial systems, companies like JP Morgan have over financing like certain sewage or water systems, like their vision or their sort of sense, definition of what a city is based on what they fund is different. And so I think like I say that to say like all these are kind of in active contestation with each other. And I think individuals that are attending to things like housing or doing advocacy for education or things like they sort of understand that. And so we just need to yeah, we need to like preserve this kind of contestation um in democracy and like stay flexible on the fact that depending on which actors we're talking about, like they sort of define, understand the city, or incentivized to care about the city differently, and just be nuanced in that way.
I mean, what you were just saying, Sarena, reminded me of something Kim invoked, of course, the great neologism of neoliberalism, and you sort of talking about JP Morgan there and financing of sort of physical infrastructure. I mean, one of the things that we're, and perhaps I'm thinking about this a lot because I gave a lecture to undergraduates on this subject this morning, but one of the things that's been animating a conversation for a while is the quote unquote neoliberal sort of ways of thinking, ways of governing logics breaking down. Have they been since the sort of since 2016, really? How do you see these playing out in your stories, but in cities more generally? The sort of the idea of the neoliberal city, is it strengthening? Is it weakening, both as an idea, but also actually as a set of approaches to governance and a sort of cocktail of public policies as well?
I mean, I think One of the things I think has been interesting is to look at the afterlife of COVID. And I think there you can almost imagine like sort of the sort of quote unquote urban neoliberal order having the end of it having sort of two phases, which is the sort of post 2008 um, and then post COVID. And I think one of the things I think has made um, me really think that we're kind of in a post neoliberal or coming out of a neoliberal moment um, has been this sort of very muscular responses of local governments to COVID, particularly Black administrations, which really did a lot of kind of I think the sense that they were on their own and so organized so many kind of local responses, food pantries, housing assistance, eviction moratoriums, which are things that are totally against any kind of neoliberal kind of sense of governance. And those things are not easy to kind of just erase or pretend that they didn't happen. So I think in that sense, um, the kind of belief in neoliberalism, I think, was already kind of waning. And I think COVID just sort of removed that kind of belief system, that sort of strong level of kind of consensus around it, at least in some cities.
Yeah, the only thing I would really have to add to that is like to the extent that I think one of the ways that cities sort of experience like neoliberalism is through like increased privatization of goods or infrastructure. So like we were just talking about with sewage or water infrastructure, with insurance or with housing, like things like that. And so I do think I think that is felt is particularly burdensome for cities, like the private provision of goods or the private control over provision of goods, whether that be through regulatory capture or sort of like, you know, direct purveyors of mandated insurance, like auto insurers, things like that. And so, yeah, I think to the extent that like cities are kind of the ones who have to push back on that in some ways because they don't have a choice. Like the existing systems are not serving, at least in the case of majority Black post-industrial cities, like are not serving their residents. And so they have to come up with different solutions. And that's why I think it's so important to attend to the ways in which the state controls cities and either like incentivizes or prevents that sort of problem solving, I guess, with relation to this, and is why I'm so worried about the sort of preemption trend that we're seeing because I think cities, certainly in the South, during COVID, were particularly hampered by preemption when trying to address COVID, and I think that was to the detriment of the residents.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, we're nearly at the end of our time, but I mean, I don't know if there's anything that the two of you want to pick up on or ask each other that have come from the conversation or anything else, Sarena and Kim.
I think that this is a really a fascinating and important moment in how we think about Black cities and particularly the history of Black cities. I think that um, it's been a century or so since the beginning of the first Great Migration. And I think we're just now kind of grappling with how this Great Migration really shaped not only local politics, but I think national politics as well. And I think that this will really help us think about not only what happened in the past, but also think about, well, what does it mean to have people live in places in different ways with different kinds of demands. So even as we move from majority Black cities, we're now thinking about Black suburbanization. So what does it mean when the majority, over 50% of African Americans are now living in suburban areas? And so will we see maybe similar types of kind of mobilizations and insurgencies, or will we see a wholly different kind of politics emerge?
Yeah, I mean, I just think the local is at the locals would has to deal with gun issues, with climate issues, with you know, rent prices, like that's where all this is felt and experienced. And so to the extent that we can, use history to inform our understanding of, again, like what cities should be able to do, or like their importance, or what they have done. I think all of that is really important, and we definitely need to carve out some more space and like more control for cities if we want a more inclusive economy, and like they need to lead. And so I hope that that's where we go.
Well, thank you very much, Kim and Sarena. That's been a fascinating conversation, and I'm sure it's given everyone lots to ponder. And thank you, everyone, for joining us online for this virtual LOC seminar series event. We hope to see you soon. Our next event in the seminar series is on the 25th of April at 6 p.m. UK time, and we'll all be in the conventional time zones by then. So please do join us again, and you can always watch the events in the LOC series that go up on the Rothermere's American Institute YouTube channel afterwards. So there's a living archive of our LOC seminar series. But all that remains is just to say thanks again, Kim and Sarena, and I mightily look forward to reading both of your books.
Yeah.